Angela Mancini, welcome to Leadership Disrupted.
Thank you for having me.
Now, your organisation, Control Risks, speaks with governments, business leaders every day about risk. And I'm assuming that because of the COVID-19 crisis, it's turned the world on its head for individuals, for governments, for businesses. Are governments, are businesses talking to you about different things? Have they changed their priorities as they think about risk because of COVID-19?
Yeah, certainly COVID, exactly, you're right. COVID-19 has turned the business world and also geopolitics to some extent on its head. What we've seen is, every year we produce a risk map looking at the risks for the coming year. We did that in January 2020. And what we're finding, interestingly enough, is there's not a lot of new risks that are coming to the fore. It's more the acceleration of risk trends that we've already seen, but there are a few key areas that are notable. The first is fraud and disputes. So we're seeing a lot of companies come to us and say, we're having trouble with internal malfeasance in the company, problems with our partners. Some of that is related to malfeasance that's happening now because people are under economic pressure, and so they're stealing and not paying bills and the like of it. But some of it is related to the fact that things may have been going on for some time that companies just didn't take the time to really look business unit by business unit at ROIs and see where there may be leaking money. So that's been an interesting area. Another interesting area is geopolitics. We've all been watching the US-China trade war for quite a long time. And that does, manifest itself in things like export controls and things that are really acute issues for certain businesses in certain sectors. But what we're seeing now is, COVID, we're clearly seeing that COVID-19 has meant that what has happened is that countries are not really aligning and cooperating as it relates to responses. That's been one of the unfortunate things we've seen, is a lack of coordination and a rise in economic nationalism and a rise in some of the very specific geopolitical avenues that certain countries want to take. So, again, we've talked a lot about US-China, but if you look at what's happened with China and India, that's been a huge issue, right? Because the border clash that they had recently has now led to a boycott China movement in India. But India, for example, the pharma sector gets 70% of its inputs from the Chinese market. So there are, very rapid changes to business that they have to absorb and deal with that are related to geopolitics.
Yeah,
and the final.
Oh, sorry, carry on.
No, go ahead.
No, I could see that businesses would be challenged because their markets are changing, but surely because of COVID-19, it needs to be an examination of business models in total.
Absolutely. And we're having clients say to us that their executive leadership is spending 18 hours a day thinking through not just how do you address the emergency situation of making sure your people are fine and health and safety issues and you can still go to market, but really taking time to think through what is our business model now? What are we bringing to market? What does that look like? How do we do that? And what's interesting, and I think the area where boards can really focus here is making sure they're getting that right. So a lot of business models are being kind of ripped up and start from scratch around how do we think about what we're taking to market, what does that supply chain look like, where's the business actually going to be, what's the demand going to be, and for what in the next few months and years. But along with that is a real recognition of we have to get it right in terms of things like ESG, environmental, social, and governance. So it's not, as you're thinking about moving your supply chain, you really need to make sure that that new supply chain has no issues with child labor or Modern Slavery Act and the like. And as you're changing up what you're doing, are you making sure you're doing that in the most sustainable way that you can? Because that's been one of the newer risks that we've seen come to the fore, is a real activist, investor, and consumer focus on environment, sustainable,ty and those types of issues, which companies just cannot ignore.
Yeah, but are you seeing organisations react fast enough? I mean, when business drops off by 50% or even 99%, like the airlines, I'm sure in an absolute crisis situation, companies will react fast. But what about those organisations that are impacted but they haven't fallen off a cliff? Are you seeing them react fast enough, or are they waiting?
It's a bit of a mix. Some of them are reacting quickly and kudos to them, but we're seeing a lot of clients that are just struggling. If your revenue has dropped more than 50%, you don't have a choice. You are hustling you're shutting down the business for a few days, really rethinking your strategic plan. But if your revenues drop 20 or 30%, you're heavily impacted and you're thinking, how do we think about restructurings? How do we think about staff? But unfortunately, probably too many of them are moving a little bit too slowly. And I think the challenge becomes, how do you make sure that your professionals in your security and your compliance department and your strategy department, they're not just thinking about the acute recovery of, how do we get through the next quarter or the next, financial year, but are they really taking the time to think about, what's next for us? How do we actually build a resilient business? How do we build a business where the demand is actually going to be, and what does that look like? And unfortunately, I think a lot of companies they're just stuck, and it's hard too, because the executive leadership teams are tired. It's been a long few months. There's a lot of uncertainty right at a time where certainty would have an absolute premium, but there's not a lot of it. And so when you can't gauge demand, you can't gauge when you can even travel to get deals done or acquisitions done. It's very difficult for companies to plan, but unfortunately they do, in our view, need to really sit and think through, what's their game plan going forward, and how do they build resiliency in their business for the next shock?
I'm really interested in what you just said about the certainty. And do you think that this uncertainty is forcing companies to adjust their culture and the way they interact?
So I think that certainly, if you're saying how does the uncertainty in the market now change culture, I think that there has been some changes, some really positive changes. There's been changes, obviously, there's pressures with remote working and isolation and mental well-being and the rest of it. But there has been more of a democratization of communication and of leadership that we've seen, which has been great, right? So in staff meetings, it's no longer who's in the room physically, seated closer to the CEO and who's loudest in the room right there in their physical presence, because in all those boxes, everyone has the same size and the same ability to speak up. So there's been some interesting cultural changes we've seen, just even at a very kind of micro level. But I think there's, when you have an opportunity, which it is an opportunity actually, as we have now, for businesses to really, really be forced to take a step back and say, what are we doing? How are we making money? And how are we actually doing what we do in a way that's, again, ethical, sustainable, good for employees, good for the good for the not just shareholder value, but good for the community writ large. There's a lot of opportunity there to make changes.
Angela, this is fascinating, and I think we could probably spend hours delving into this, but for today I'd like to stop there, and perhaps I could invite you back next week, and I'd like to delve into some of the softer issues around ESG that you talked about. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much.